Hi and welcome to the fourth episode of my tutorial series on AWS using CDK TypeScript. My name is Faruk and I will be guiding you through the basics of AWS CodePipeline. Let's have a look at the agenda in this video. So the goal in this video is to implement an AWS CodePipeline using CDK TypeScript. Before we do that, we will have a look at the differences between the CodePipeline and the Github Actions, which we implemented in the last episode. We'll also have a look at CodePipeline with and without the Lambda in the stack, and also more generally in a stack with a Lambda and without the Lambda, what does that output? And finally, we will set up our own CodePipeline to deploy the my first CDK stack that we made earlier. So if you haven't made that yet, then maybe watch the last episodes and create the stack and then come back to this video. So let's start with comparing CodePipeline with Github Actions. I made a schema here and let's start at the top. So the first line is for inputs. As you can see, CodePipeline, you can have code from GitHub, Bitbucket, AWS CodeCommit, or Amazon S3. And if you want to use GitHub Actions, you can only use code that's on GitHub. If we look at where to deploy to, with CodePipeline, you can practically deploy anywhere, but it's mainly meant to deploy to the AWS cloud. And with GitHub Actions, you could do multi-vendor. So if you also have Azure, you could also deploy there. Then the next line is about authentication. So if you're going to use CodePipeline in combination, let's say with GitHub, we will need GitHub OAuth token. And if we want to use GitHub Actions like we did in the video last time, we will need the AWS credentials to be inserted in the secrets. Then the next line is about getting started. Well, the CodePipeline is it's a bit difficult to get started with. In comparison to the GitHub Actions, which is very easy, just one YAML file. We did it in the last episode. And this episode, we will do the CodePipeline and you can judge for yourself which is more difficult. And so the CodePipeline contains a lot of code that you need to set up in CDK. And the GitHub Action is just a YAML file, like I said. Then if we have a look at cost-related stuff, so CodePipeline gives us, it's not really CodePipeline because CodeBuild is the action that's actually building our code in CodePipeline, and that gives us 100 free minutes a month to use CodeBuild. In GitHub Actions, we get minimum of 2,000, and if you have an enterprise account or not a free account, you get more minutes a month. And finally, GitHub Actions are free. And CodePipeline, you can have one active pipeline that's for free. And every pipeline after that costs $1 or $2 a month, depending on the encryption key and the pipeline that you're using. So if we compare these to each other, you would say GitHub Actions is probably the easier pick in this choice, but there are some cases that you can use CodePipeline. Think about you don't have code on GitHub and also not on GitLab, because GitLab also has their own runner. Then CodePipeline is an option. I've had to use CodePipeline in the past when we were using CodeCommit. We couldn't make any repositories outside of AWS. So in that case, CodePipeline is a perfect solution. But like I said, it's a bit more difficult to start with, but we're gonna go through that in this episode. So before we get started, let's have a look at the differences between deploying a stack with and without the Lambda in it. So on the left, we see a AWS CloudFormation stack. Let's say it's a CDK stack, and it contains a lot of components. So API Gateway, RDS, DynamoDB, and so on. And on the right, we have a CloudFormation template, so a CDK stack, containing a Lambda, comparable to the stack that we made. If we output this and we want to deploy this, what happens on the back when we do CDK deploy is that it will output a CloudFormation template. So this entire stack will result into a single CloudFormation template, and that CloudFormation template contains the names of the components and the configuration that we want to deploy. So if we look on the right side, it only contains one Lambda, but if we look at the output, we see that it has an extra output. So it has a CloudFormation template, but it had also an asset bucket for the code that should be inside of the Lambda. And inside of the template of this CloudFormation stack, it has a reference to the bucket or place where the code is stored. And when using CDK, normally this is a standard default bucket inside of your account. But when using CodePipeline, and that's why it is important to understand this, CodePipeline uses its own bucket. So the CloudFormation template that we will have will not have the correct reference to the bucket where the code is stored. And we will fix this in the pipeline later, but it's important to know why we are doing this. So if you are deploying only AWS components, it will result in just a CloudFormation template YAML. And if you're using Lambda code, you will also have an asset bucket. Okay, now that we have that, let's get started with retrieving our Github token. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is go to Github. Then again in the settings, we're going to go to developer settings. And we want to create a token to use in our code pipeline for accessing our code. So Github has fine-grained tokens. That's new, so let's use it. I'm going to call it demo token. Let's see. I have it in other organization GitHub account, so that's what I'll be selecting. I only want a single repository, which will be my first CDK. And then we need to add a couple permissions. So the permissions that we're gonna add is content. I'm gonna do read only. And what we also need is webhooks. There I'm gonna do read write. Okay. And because I'm an organization, so if you're also an organization, we also need to do that here. So here we're gonna do projects and we're gonna do webhooks, read write. Okay. Then we're going to generate a token. I will now copy this token and go to my AWS Console. And in the console, we need to save this in the secret manager. And the reason why we're doing this is so that we don't need to put it into our stack that we're gonna upload also to GitHub. So this is just best practice. So let's say other type. I'm gonna give it the key secret, and the pair will be just what I copied from GitHub. And next we'll call it demo GitHub token for GitHub demo pipeline. Okay, we don't need that now. Okay. Okay, now we have a demo token and we will use this later on in our stack. And this is just best practice to keep our token safe. And like I said before with the access and secret token, I will also delete this one after the video, well, before the video. But don't share your token with other people. Okay, now that we have that, let's go on to the next step. Now that we have our GitHub token, we need to make some adjustments to our stack that we want to deploy. So I opened my first CDK stack and we're gonna make a couple adjustments, but before we do that, let's switch to a different branch. So I'm gonna create a new branch from. I'll call it CodePipeline and from CI/CD. Okay, we're now on a new branch and we need to adjust a couple things. So first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go inside of the tsconfig file, and here I'm just gonna add one line, and that's the out there dist. And what this does is when we do CDK build, it will build it not into each separate directory, but it will distill everything into dist folder so that we have all our outputs actually in one directory. I will save this. Then we will open the lib. In the lib, we will have to change a couple things. So, like I explained earlier, currently when we are synthesizing this template, it will have a reference to the standard bucket, so the asset bucket, and it will get the code from there. But when we're going to use the code pipeline, this bucket will not contain the asset code that we want for the Lambda. So we need to have a different reference in the CloudFormation template. And how we're going to do that is as follows. First, we will import S3, and because we want to reference the S3 bucket that we're going to use in the code pipeline. And at the moment, we don't know exactly which pipeline bucket it will be, and we also don't know the key. And there's a way to solve this, and that is to use a CFN parameter. And what the CFN parameter is, it's actually for now, it will have a default value of empty string. But when we synthesize it, you can pass in a parameter, and then we will pass a parameter for the bucket name. And I will also do this for the bucket key, which we only know when the pipeline is running. And we will then pass it through when synthesizing our template inside of the pipeline. And now that we have these two CFN parameters, we need to also reference the bucket that we are using in the pipeline. And for that, I will create a new const, which is a S3 bucket, which will be a bucket from bucket name. This is also where we use the CFN parameter for bucket name. And CFN parameters have a couple values inside of them, and we'll just use value as string. So now we have a bucket and we have a bucket key. And what we need to do is change the reference of the code key here. So instead of the asset bucket, that would be the default bucket, we're going to replace this with lambda.code.fromBucket. And here we pass in the bucket that we reference here and the bucket key. And the object key, like I said, we only know this after we've built it and put it inside. So this will also be a CFN parameter. And because it's a CFN parameter, we will also do value as string. I think that's it. Let's see. Yeah. So let's save this. And one last thing that I will do is, because I have a minor bug in the test here when using it in the code pipeline, I will comment this out. And once that is done, we are ready to commit this to our repository, and it will create a new branch, and this branch is the branch that we'll be deploying in the code pipeline. So let's do git add all, git commit, code pipeline demo, and this is again a new branch, so we need to do git push -u origin code pipeline. Okay, now we should have our branch on GitHub, and next thing we need to do is create a new branch. Well, we'll create a new stack, and in that stack we'll create a code pipeline which will reference this repository and then deploy the stack, the branch code pipeline that we just created. Okay, let's start creating our code pipeline. I created a fresh new CDK stack, called it AWS CDK CodePipeline, and I will start adjusting it and creating a code pipeline. Before we do that, let's dive into the project structure. Before we just used the lib to deploy a simple Lambda function, but now we will do a little bit more. So it's maybe good to know what the project structure is and how to use it. So if we first open the bin contains a file, and this here is the name of our stack. So if you want to change the name of your stack on AWS, you can change it here. And in here, you can pass in extra configuration. And this you can do if you have, for example, multiple stacks. You can have different configuration files, and then you can have one stack deploying into multiple environments or with different configurations in the same environment. We will utilize bin in this tutorial, so I will create a new file here. I will, one second, create a new file. I will call it stack config types.ts. And in here, I will copy and paste in this tutorial a lot because it will just take too much time to type everything out. But I will go through everything as we go through it. So what I'm doing here is I'm importing stack props from the AWS CDK lib library. And then I'm creating a new interface called AWS CDK CodePipeline stack props. And this extends the normal stack props. And I'm just giving all the additional configuration variables that I want to pass in to my CDK stack here, and I'm defining the types. So I'm expecting an object with a role name, a description, and a manage policy. I'm expecting a key description. I'm expecting for Github a token secret name, owner, repository, and a branch. And for CodeBuild, I'm expecting a couple strings, and also for CodePipeline, but we will come across them as I implement them in the stack, and I will give a more broad explanation on what they exactly are. So for now, I'm just gonna save this, and you don't have to make an interface, but I like to do it because that way it's just a little bit more secure. You know if your stack config is adhering to what you actually want it to be. So let's go to the second file that we need to create. So we will create another file, and this I will call stack config ts. And you can have actually multiple of these stack configs, but for now we're just gonna use one. Oh, 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So what we're doing here is the types that we just passed in as the props, we are defining them with values. And I'm calling this object environment config. And like I said, if you have different stacks, so let's say you have a multi-environment, you can call this dev config and have another exactly the same file with different values and call it production environment or acceptance environment. And here I just pass in the values, and these values I will be using in the lib directory. So the bin contains our stack and our stack config, and this way we can have multi-environment if we want. And in the lib directory, the lib contains all the components that we want to deploy in our AWS environment. I will get to the lib in a second, but before we do that, still one more thing that we need to change here. So because we are gonna pass in the configurations, I will import the environment configurations here and replace this object here with the object that we just created. So these environment configurations are now getting injected into this stack, and we can use them in the lib. So I'll save this as well. If you have any questions about these, you can also just leave a comment and I will respond to them when I can. Okay, so the lib, and the lib is gonna be a really big one. So let's get started. I will first just copy in all the dependencies, and then you can see why creating a code pipeline can be a little bit difficult. So these are all the dependencies that we need. We're gonna use IAM, we're gonna use KMS, so for encryption. We're gonna use a S3 bucket to store our code and our artifacts in the code pipeline. We're gonna use Secret Manager for getting our Github token from our account that we created earlier. We're gonna use CodeBuild. In CodeBuild, like I said earlier, we are building the code. We're gonna use CodePipeline as the pipeline which contains the code builds and the output. We're going to use CodePipeline Actions to define the actions that we're taking in the pipeline and orchestrate the changes. And in my last video, I had a comment asking for notifications. So I'm also adding notifications from CodeStar notifications and SNS subscription. And this is a way to get notified when CodeBuild succeeds or fails. All these components we'll be using them later, and I will explain a little bit more on them. And then what we also need is to import the config types that we created earlier. And what I will do is substitute the stack props here with the ones that I extended. So these are the stack props with the extended variables that I want to add in my stack. Okay. Then first thing that we're gonna do is create an IAM user. And IAM user. Okay, so I'm creating a new IAM user. And this is just the name that's in the stack. That's not really important. And here we see that the first properties are getting used. So for the role name, I will use the properties props.role.name. And props is this object, and it will contain, so if we go back here and have a look, it will contain this name. So you can have multiple stacks with different roles and different names. So if you're confused about it, just leave a comment, but that's what I'm using it for. Same as for the description. And then I will give it an assumed by, and that's a new IAM composite principle, because I want to have multiple IAM principles in it. So I want this role, and we're going to use this role for everything in the code pipeline. So I want it to be able to be assumed by CloudFormation, by CodeBuild and CodePipeline. And finally, what I'm doing here is I'm attaching a managed role. And if you're using this in a production environment, like I said earlier, this is a demo. So I'm giving it admin access. If you don't want to do that, you can give it a more fine-grained permissions. And it's not really hard to find it. If you Google permissions for CodePipeline, you will get the list that you need. But do note that if you're deploying different components, you will also need different permissions. But for now, I will just add all admin permissions. So this is the role that we're going to use to verify that we can actually use all services. Next thing that we need to import is KMS Key. And the KMS key that we are importing, you don't actually need to create the KMS key yourself. The reason that I'm doing it is because I'm passing in the removal policy. And the removal policy here is normally set on retain. And what that means is if I would destroy my stack, this KMS key will still be retained in my account. And after this demo, I want to remove it. That's why I'm creating it. That way I have a little bit more control on it. I can also grant it encryption and decryption permissions on the role. And I'm giving it the removal policy destroy. And like I said, if you want to maintain the KMS key, because once you've lost it, you can actually not decrypt the bucket key, objects anymore, then just remove the remove policy if you want to use this in production. So, okay, we have our KMS key, and we're going to use that, like I said, for encrypting. And what do we encrypt? We encrypt the objects that we are storing in the buckets. It can be the source code, it can be the build outputs or the templates, and we are encrypting them with our key, and when we take them out, we will decrypt them as well. Next thing that we are importing is the Github token. And for the Github token, what we're doing is using the secrets manager, and in the secrets manager, we're gonna use the from secret name, and then version 2, we just need to pass in the scope, that's this is just the name we use in the stack, and this has to contain the name for the secret. And like I explained earlier, if we look at GitHub and then token secret name, it's the demo GitHub token. This is also the name that we gave it earlier when we were creating it. Okay, once we have the GitHub token in, we will also grant read rights for this secret for the role. And then we can continue to the next thing. And so the next object that we're going to create is the S3 buckets and the artifact folders that we will use. And I will explain a bit more what they exactly are. So we're first creating an S3 bucket, and again we're just passing in the name from the properties. We're going to use the encryption key that we created here to encrypt all the artifacts that are in here. And again, you have to pass the encryption KMS if you're using encryption. And the removal policy and auto delete objects is also again added because it's a demo, and after the demo I want to remove it. But S3 object that has an S3 bucket that has objects in it has a retain policy. That's why I'm adding the auto delete objects and the removal policy. Then we're also granting again the role grant read and write. And what we're doing next, this is very important. So we're creating 3 artifacts. And what are artifacts? Artifacts are locations where the code pipeline will store or retrieve code or files from. So the first artifact that we're creating is called source. This will be used when we pull the code from GitHub. We will store it in source. Then we will have one for template output, and we will have one for Lambda output. The template output will contain the CloudFormation template, and the Lambda output will contain the Lambda code, and that's also the bucket that we will have to pass on as a parameter. Okay, so we have the bucket, we have a couple artifacts. Next thing that we're going to build is the CodeBuild. And for CodeBuild, because we're going to use 2 CodeBuilds, and I don't like to repeat myself in the code, we're going to use a function. And this function, let's just go through it quickly. It's called getBuildSpecs. It will get the name, it will get the commands to execute, the directory, some file names. It's a string array, and what it will do, it will return a new CodeBuild object of the type pipeline project, and scope is this. It will contain a name for in the stack, but it's also the name that we're using for project name. We will use the role that we were using all along. Same goes for the key. And then for the environment, we are using, this is very important, build image, CodeBuild Linux image, and just use the latest one. You can have actually errors if you use a lower version. It can cause all kinds of issues, so just pay attention that you're using Linux image standard 6 or 5. Any of them is good. And then we pass in the build spec. Build spec is almost like the GitHub YAML that we created. So what we have here is build spec from object. So we're gonna pass in a JSON object, and in this JSON object, we first have to define a version, and then we have a couple of phases. And you can't just make up any phases. There are certain phases like install, build, pre-build, and post-build. What I'm using here is install for installing the dependencies. Then I'm gonna build it. So I'm running npm run build. And after everything is built, I'm gonna run some post commands. And this is made variable because I'm using this for both creating the templates and creating the Lambda. And I want them to be running simultaneously. And I will show that also later. But let's create 2 build templates so that we can use them in our code pipeline. So I'm creating the first build template and then build Lambda, and I'm just passing the function with some parameters. I'm passing in a name, I'm passing a command, and this is a command, so npx CDK synthesize. I'm passing here the stack name that I want to synthesize and the location where the CDK template should be stored. So I'm storing also this one in the dist folder. Then I'm giving the directory. So this is for, if we look here, the directory where we will look for artifacts to store in the output. And then we're specifying all the files we want to output. So here we're going to say we want the template. And in the case of the JSON file, we're gonna, and this is a JSON file that's in the main directory, but for the Lambda code, it will be in dist and then source. And then we're just gonna take, well, in this case, it's index.js, but if you called it differently, you can of course just change the name there. Okay, we have 2 CodeBuild templates, and now we need to make some code actions that make use of these things. But before we go use the build templates, we of course need to get the code from Github. And for that, we will use a CodePipeline action. And we will use the Github CodePipeline action to be specific. Let me copy that in. So we are creating a new Github CodePipeline action. And Github source action, in this case, it will take in an action name. Don't think you can use spaces here, so do mind that. You have an output, and output will be, in this case, where the action will store whatever it does. In this case, it will retrieve our code and then save it in the output artifact. So this is the artifact that we created earlier. Then we need to pass a couple of parameters for the repository that we are pulling the code from. So owner, repo, branch, and then the OAuth token. So the OAuth token is the GitHub token that we are retrieving here. But because it's a token, it will be a JSON object. And how we get the value for it is GitHub token secret value from JSON. And I called it, the key in my secret was secret. So if you have a different key, do mind that you need to change the key name here. And finally, when will this trigger? And there we use CodePipeline GitHub trigger on webhooks. And that just means that whenever there's a push, or whenever someone commits code to the repository, the action will be kicked off. And then I'm passing in a run order. And the reason why I'm passing in a run order, you don't actually need to do this, but I'm doing this because I want to run the code build for the template and the Lambda at the same time. So in the next 2 builds, in the next 2 actions, I'm gonna both give them run order 2, and this will make them run simultaneously, and they will give their output to the run order 3, which we will get to in a bit. So like the one before, I built a function that will give me the CodeBuild actions. And the reason why I do this, you might think you are only doing 2. Why are you building a function? Imagine that you have 10 lambdas. Well, 10 is maybe exaggerating, but let's say 4 lambdas would happen to be in one stack. Then you would have to have a separate build phase for all of these to store their codes in different artifacts. And then it's just really handy to have a function and not to do it by hand, because it's already a very long stack. As you see, we are over 100 rules, 100 lines, and it would just be a monolithic stack. So again here, what we're doing is passing a name, a build template that we created, and the object artifactory where we want to save it. And what it will do, it will create a new code pipeline. And this is a code build action. And because we're using a code build action, it's just the name, the role that we wanna use for the code build, to have an input where it will get the code from the source. Then we will use the project, which in this case is one of these 2 build specs, and it will output in an artifact. And the artifact like this is template output or lambda output, and those are the artifacts that we have here. So just to have a brief recap, we have a code build. One of them will execute the command that we have here, npx synthesize the stack name, and then put it in the dist. And we have another code build that will just build the code. It will run the test, in this case, npm run test, and then just use the code that's stored in that bucket to pass on for the next action. So we're getting the code, we're building both of those things. And then where it gets a bit complicated is in the deployment step. And before I get that, maybe it's really handy to say that you can actually run your CDK deploy command here, and it will deploy it. Then you also don't need to swap the parameters in your stack. But I just wanted to show you what the way is how to use it. So we're gonna do it how it's supposed to be used. So we have now created the deploy action, and what the deploy action to deploy CloudFormation template is the CloudFormation create update stack action. You can also use a different one, but I'm going to use this one. And what we do again is just give it a role name. We pass in the role. Also for the deployment role here, we also pass in a role. I'm also going to pass it admin permissions because I want it to be able to create IAM roles. And I'm also going to say replace on failure true. We might not need it, but I just added it because if you don't do this and your stack is on rollback or it failed deploying, this pipeline will fail. And by adding this one on true, it will just remove that stack and redeploy it. So here we have to pass in the stack name once again, and we have to pass in the template path. And for this we are using the output of the artifactory. So template output at path. This is where we get the CloudFormation template. And in this CloudFormation template at this moment, we do not have the correct bucket name and bucket key name that we actually want as parameters in our CDK stack. So that's where the next command comes into play, extra inputs. As an extra input, we're gonna add the Lambda artifact that we just created. And the Lambda artifact has a couple parameters, and we're using them in the parameter overrides. So in the parameter overrides, we're saying that the bucket parameter that we are using in the CloudFormation template here, we want to override that with the Lambda outputs bucket name and the Lambda outputs bucket object. And here we do have access to both of them because we just created it. And we're passing it through by passing it through extra inputs. So by using parameter overrides, now our stack CDK, my first CDK stack, now also has the bucket name and bucket key. It needs to synthesize a new template to deploy. And now it will have the correct reference to the code that we want to deploy with. Then finally the run order tree. And like I said earlier, the run orders just say that I want to run the first two builds, so this one and this one, consecutively. And when they are both done, I want them to pass in the outputs to the deployment action, which will run as a third step. Now that we have our code build and our code pipeline actions, we can finally create our pipeline. Okay, so let's see. For the code pipeline, it's fairly simple after you've got everything. So we're creating a code pipeline. It's just a new code pipeline and then pipeline. It's just a stack name. We have a pipeline name. We have a role, that's just a role that we created earlier. Then here we are passing in the artifact bucket that we created all the way here. And by doing this, we are actually saying CodePipeline use this specific bucket. If you don't do it, it will also create a bucket. So it's not like if you don't do it, it will use the default bucket. It will just create a bucket. I created it because then you have control over it when you remove it. And besides that, all of these artifacts will then be subdirectories inside of this bucket. So if you want to look up the artifacts yourself, they are inside of that bucket. Okay, let's go back. So we were at the artifact bucket. Then we're going to define the stages. And in the stages, you can just define the steps of your pipeline. Here I'm defining a source that will be the GitHub action. So this is also where we use those CodePipeline actions we just defined. In the second build phase, I'm going to use two actions. So I'm going to use the build template action and I'm going to use the build Lambda action. And finally, we will deploy our Lambda into our environment. And this is the pipeline. And after that, just to be sure that the pipeline can assume the role, I've added this because I've had issues with it before. So I'm adding a policy statement to the pipeline that it can assume the role that we just created. That is the pipeline, but because in my last video, Wolfgang asked for notifications. Let's also add some notifications here. So I'm gonna add a topic. So I'm just creating an SNS topic and I'm just giving it a name. Then I will, let's see. We have to grant, of course, this topic has to we have to grant the role publishing rights on this topic. And what I'm doing next is for each email that's in the here. So we have a sub email. This you can just add emails here, and for each email containing in the props topic sub emails, it will add the email subscription. And what that does is each person will just get an email from SNS saying, hey, you've been added to a subscription. And then from then you will be updated with new messages on this topic. So we have our SNS topic, but now we need to also put something on that topic. So we're gonna do this. We want to do this also for both of the build phases. So I should note that CodeStar notifications are for code build. So they are only for this action and for this action. We don't actually get notifications for this one. So we're gonna get a notification if the template is successfully built or fails, or the Lambda is successfully built or fails. it will not give us a notification on this one. But anyway, let's set that up as well. So here I'm just gonna map over, let's just go through what I did. I'm creating an array, and it creates the source. Like I said, it creates the build object for the template and the build spec for the Lambda, and a name, which will then create a new notification rule with the name. This is just the stack name. And what's important here is this: we're passing in the topic that we want to target and the actions that we want it on. So we want it on CodeBuild success and CodeBuild fails. You actually have more of them, so if you want to have even more, there's a link in the video description where you can see even more of these events that you want to be notified on. And the source, do note that if you're passing in these build templates that you need the source of the template. And with this, our stack is concluded. So let's go over what we have. We have a CodePipeline, which will get our code. Let's save this. Which will get our code from what we define here. It will be, for me, coding with Faruk. Then repository my first CDK, and the branch will be CodePipeline. These are just names that these two you can just make yourself. The target stack, well, like I said, the stacks are written here. So just go to your stack, see what's listed here, and that's the name that we need to add in our configuration for target stack. Target Lambda, well, my Lambda was index.ts, but when you are building your code, it will always be converted to JavaScript because you're not running TypeScript in the Lambda. So do note that it is JS, but this is the file name for where my code is. So target Lambda. Pipeline name, you can come up with any name you want. Bucket name. Bucket name has to be unique. So if you're gonna do like CodePipeline bucket, do note that it's not gonna be available. I'm just doing a very long one. You can do a very unique one or a long one, but it has to be unique or it will fail. I'm adding a topic name, can be anything. And I'm not adding any emails right now, but you can add emails if you want, multiple even. And for the role here, role name you can decide for yourself, description you can decide for yourself, and the managed role policy, like I said, I'm using administrator access. You can also use different ones. You can have a look in IAM, and there's also a AWS CodePipeline admin role. You can use that one. It does need some extra permissions. And for the key description, yeah, it's a description, so you can fill it in yourself. I think that's all the config that we're using here. And this is all our components. And then finally, what I did is I also created some tests to add to the stack. And I won't go through all of the tests now, but I just want to run the tests to check if the stack is complete. And like I said, I will make a different episode devoted only on testing, where we'll go through unit testing, testing your CloudFormation stack, and maybe also testing API with Postman through our pipeline. But for now, let's just run this test. So I'm going to save this. Okay, everything seems alright. Then next step is to deploy our CDK stack. And once you deploy it, the first time that you've deployed it, it will actually run automatically and get the code. So your stack does need to be ready for it. So let's do it. CDK deploy. And again, it will, of course, first let see an overview of the components, which will be a lot this time. And we'll have to confirm. Let's go through them first. So we can see build Lambda, build template, okay. Okay, I'm not 100% sure, but it looks good. So let's say yes. Now we're gonna deploy it onto our AWS account. This can take a moment, so I'll just skip through it. Okay, now our stack has been successfully deployed to our AWS environment. Let's go to our AWS account and have a look. So in our AWS Console, I'm gonna go to CodePipeline, bookmarked it there. And as you can see, I've already checked it out and we're already in the build stage, and we are running them both in parallel. So we're currently building the CloudFormation template and we're building the Lambda code. They will both be outputted into Artifact and then passed on to the deploy action. And this can also take a second. Okay, we're now deploying our CloudFormation with the correct output and reference to the buckets, which will hopefully then deploy our Lambda function. You can already open the CloudFormation up, and there we should see the stack creation. Oh, it says completed already. So now our stack has been deployed. Let's have a look inside of the stack. So we do have a resource in it, a Lambda. Let's check it out. And it is the Lambda code that we are expecting. But let's also just test it out as we did in the video that we built the stack in. So test. Gonna do name and value. We will enter Faruk. Save this. And there we have it. Good job, Faruk. So what did we do? We deployed the My First CDK. We replaced the place that the code is. Instead of asset code, we are using parameters to pass in the bucket. And then through a code pipeline, we deployed our Lambda code into our stack. And there was one more thing that I wanted to say. So currently we have 2 build actions, and that's only because we have a Lambda in our stack. If you wouldn't have a Lambda in your stack, you can just have a single build output, which will then be your template, and you don't have to subsidize or reference to S3 bucket. So you can also use this CI/CD pipeline for stacks that don't contain a Lambda function in it. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments, or if you have any other stacks that you would like to see, also just add them in the comments and I will consider creating a new video on them.